Welcome once again. We're going to talk today about light and shade and how to structure your tones in a logical way. We're going to analyze the character of light and also touch on the philosophy of light. And we will be talking about a hierarchy of values and tones, the difference between shade and shadow, and how to describe it simply, and then in a way to arrive at more complexity. Okay. So, now are we live with the, do we have the other one going? Yeah. Okay. So, first off, the absolutes of light. We have absolute darkness, absolute light. Those are the two extremes. Absolutes are right on the very edge of our comprehension. We mostly deal with things in mixture, right? And that's where it becomes difficult to judge, is when there are things in mixture. So this is where we're going to put our emphasis. And we'll begin by saying that you have dark, light, and midtone. Actually, I'll call this halftone. So we'll call these 3 degrees, the 3 degrees of light. Okay? They are in degrees. These are absolutes. These are in degrees. And then we'll divide these 3 degrees into three divisions. So we have basically a higher, a lower, and a, whoops. A higher, a mid, and a lower. So we have a higher light, a mid light, and a lower light. We have a higher halftone, a mid halftone, a lower halftone. We have a higher dark, mid dark, lower dark, right? So if you can organize in your mind these values from simple to complex, we just really have 3 families of tone, each of which has a higher, mid, and lower family member, right? How many values does that make? We don't count 0, we have 10. We have 9 plus 1, right? So we'll call that scale a scale of values, a 10-value scale. So we'll call these light degrees of light and these values that come from those families of light, right? So if you look here, we have 2 absolutes of light. We have 2 absolutes of light and 3 degrees, light, halftone, dark, 10 values of light in this structure. And if we divide each one, not dividing black, but dividing all the values into 4, that gives us 40 tones. So we're taking each value and dividing it, or as we might say, we're quadrating it, right, into 4. That gives us 40 tones. to think about. And that is plenty of a range to begin to identify where you are in terms of value and tone in a composition. So let's look at how to use this structuring of light. First, let's look at a few concepts about the behavior of light on form. So light, what is light? Light is both a particle and a wave, right? So it has these two behaviors. If we think of it as particles, as little photons bouncing from the light source onto the form, where the form is facing, if the plane is facing more towards the light, then you have more photons bouncing around, right? So our first idea about light on form is, first off, let's say we have a sphere here. Now, does a sphere have orientation? No, until you light it. And when you give light, give orientation, when you light a form, you give it orientation. It's always facing its light source. Which way does the moon face? Towards us? Towards the sun, always. At a full moon, we're seeing the face of the moon, right? The full face of the moon. It's always facing the sun, philosophically. Its light side is its face, and therefore it now has orientation. Now, so if you have your light side and your dark side, we're going to talk about how the tones are structured on this form. And we're going to distinguish these two ideas, shade and shadow. So shade is a condition on the form, and shadow is a projection of a form. So a shadow, one way to think about shadows is in contrast to signs and shadows. A shadow is a projection from the infinite onto the finite, right? If you consider the light source the infinite, a shadow is a projection from the infinite onto some finite material, right? A sign is a projection from the finite into the infinite. So a sign, a symbol of something infinite, is a material object, a finite object that projects itself onto an infinite or eternal concept. So it goes the other way. So a shadow is a projection from the infinite onto the finite, right? The difference between shadow and shade is that the shade is tied to the form. It's the orientation of the plane of the form in respect to the light determines its shade. And shadow is simply a projection onto another form. Now, what is it that divides then light and darkness? It's form. Light is a unifier, form is a divider. So if you look out in space, the sun is lighting. The rays of the sun are reaching everywhere you see out in space, but the moon is where you see the light of the sun. And that's where the light is manifest, is on the form. And it's because of that form that you have a light side and a dark side. So light is a unifier, the form is a divider, and that's a principle you'll find in painting. Now, the other thing was, another point about, so if we call this is the shade, right? And this is shadow. This line right here is the division between light and dark, right? And it can be called the terminator line, the core line, or the shade line, because it's the beginning of shade. Now the shadow is always a shadow line. The edge of a shadow is always the projection of a shade line. It's always this contour right here projected onto another surface. So you cannot have a shade line or a core line without a shadow being projected off of it, right? Because if you think of this object, if you think of your view being the view of the light source, you will see the profile of this object. As a light source, you'll see the profile. This right here is the profile that the light source is seeing, right? That's the shade line. It's the contour, the edge of the shape, and it projects to anything behind it that is lit. So there's this yoking together of the shade line and the shadow line. Now, initially when we do our shade drawings or value drawings, we won't worry about cast shadows and environment. We're just thinking about the object and the light on an object. But later, then we'll talk about how to project shadows and how to orchestrate values in a composition beyond the object. But initially, we'll just talk about how to light an object. Okay, so getting back to this idea that the photons are hitting these planes here, all in different degrees. So, sort of obvious, but the more a plane is turned away, what? Less light it receives, therefore more shade, right? Okay, so you can think of anything as a plane, right? So that is our block-in strategy, is thinking of things as planes. When we start doing structure drawings, again, we'll think of in a planar context. And then it becomes a little more clear how to treat the light on the surface and its orientation to the light source. So one question is, how much is light diminished as a plane turns away, right? There's some very cool things to talk about with that, but here's just a little intro to that. We'll get more heavy into the geometry of shade and light when we get into tone. But if we have a light source coming right here, and this is the dark side, This is 30 degrees here and 60 degrees. This is where it's at 50% diminished from this point to this point. This is 50% diminished. It's not at 45 degrees. So in other words, the compression of values is steeper right here than it is right here. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because this plane of the sphere is not turning away from the light at nearly the difference as it does once you start hitting here. It starts really turning away, right? So just so you know, just so you have in your head, that it's not at 45 degree angle, it's not at the halfway angle that you have the halfway in value and light being diminished.
It's called the exponential decrement of light.
Okay, yes. Yeah. Thank you, Nikki. The exponential decrement of light. And all that means is that it's not a linear decrease of light, it's exponential. And you see that that is because the nature of a curve. Now, when we talk about the light source relationship to the form and the size of the light to the size of the form, we get into issues about cast shadows. If you have parallel light rays, what is that? What circumstance does that suggest?
The sun.
The sun. Because the sun is theoretically of an infinite distance. So all its light rays are coming parallel. When you have a light source that's not infinite, in other words, the closer it is to the form, the less parallel the light rays are. And what does that mean? That means you start having light rays that are crossing each other. Here you have a light source that is smaller than the form. Here you have a light source that is bigger than the form. What is the difference on the shade and shadow? The shadow is softer and smaller than the form, right? Because you have light coming in from this direction. Here the shadow is larger and its shadow line is harder. So when you have a light source that has a distance like this, like a window, the edge, the one side of the window is one light source, and the other side of the window is another light source. So if you just think of this side of your light source, it has rays casting shadows, projecting this onto this other surface, and coming from here. And so that's the edge of the shadow created by this light source here. But because that light source is wide, the other side of the light source also does the same thing. So what you have is the true shadow, which is where it's being... this surface is totally obscured. The light is totally obscured by the form right here, but only partially obscured because one side of the light source is touching it. Does that make sense? And we call that penumbra. That portion, that edge of the shadow that is softened because you get more than one light ray as a source. Penumbra is where you see like a half shadow. Now, let's talk about specular light. Artie, you were asking about metallic surfaces, right? This is the case with any reflective surface, whether it's water or anything reflective like metallic. You have, when we're talking about shade, we're talking about the diffusion of light, where those photons are diffused and just partially hitting the surface. In other words, it's a condition that's bound to the orientation of the form. Specularity is not tied to the form. It's tied to your eye. You are seeing the light source reflected on the form. So the form is just simply a place for the light source to reflect and hit your eye. And when your eye changes, when your viewpoint changes, the shade does not change. The shade is tied is yoking the light source to the form, not you. But with specular light, you are tied to the equation.
You're talking about highlights.
Yes. So the highlight is a specular light. So it is different than diffused light on the form. It is dependent on your position to the form, or rather the form as a mediator between you and the light. So it is the angle. If the light source, if your eye is right here, and the light source is here, it's going to be the angle that mediates the light source and your eye, and it's separate from what's happening with the shade on the form. Does that make sense? It's just a reflection, a ricochet. What you're seeing is the light source when you're seeing the highlight or specular light. Okay. Forgot to keep track of my time here. Let's talk about So let's create a hierarchy of shade on the form. Now remember, we had 10 values and 40 tones. Those are all just universal. It's just a universal structure of light. This is going to be different when we talk about shade because it's tied again to the object. So when we talk about the 7 shades of light on form, it is light tied to the form, tied to the object. And that'll be our first focus in doing value drawings, is simply what is on the object, not what is around the object. So you have the highest light is the highlight or a specular corona. And then you have these 6 degrees of diffused light on the form. You have the full light, the form light, which is really essentially the local color. You have partial light. Then you have the lighted shade. And then you have the core shade. And then you have the full shade. And what's called occlusion, which is if you have the shadow right here, this crevice shadow right here is the darkest place you're going to be looking. That's occlusion. The cast shadow is also almost always darker than the shade on the object. The lighted shade are lighter parts on the shade side. So you're really skipping from partial shade, number 4, to coarse shade, or partial light, number 4, to coarse shade 6, right at this terminator. It's a big jump. And number 5, you might find up here in really obscure planes, or else here with reflected light. So there's also 4 qualities of light on form. So you have this structure of shade on form, but now we're going to talk about the light source and the atmosphere and the condition of the light. First, atmospheric or sfumato. That'll be more compressed. So your difference between your full light and your coarse shade will be compressed, and they'll be very close in value. And we'll call that sfumato. The second is diffused, which is not quite as compressed. Think of maybe the difference between atmospheric would be something, or sfumato would be something that's in the distance, for example, or in a very smoky environment where everything's very compressed in value. Romantic or diffuse would be like a wedding photo where things are sort of foggy and sort of compressed, and there's not the same kind of clarity as, say, in classical or natural light, where you have a full scope of values. And spotlight is like a tenebrous light, like the Baroque painters, Caravaggio, right, where you have high contrast between light and shadow. Usually that means the shadows are just dropping off. So in a scale of 40 tones, let's see, do I have? Yeah, so here's some examples. This is sort of patterned after the cubit rod, the ancient Egyptian cubit rod. The royal cubit is divided into 7 parts. Each part is called a palm. So the common cubit is 6 palms long. And Stephen and Nikki and I saw at the Egyptian Museum in Turin the ancient royal cubit rod. And so the common cubit is 6 palms, and the royal cubit is 7 palms. And each palm is divided ultimately by 4 parts. So this is just a way of thinking about how to structure the values on the form, depending on what kind of light you have. So, and here's an example. Let's see. So here we have the same image, but there's different, I'm attaching different qualities of light to the same subject. So these values are keyed to match the sfumato value range on the form. In other words, you have just 14 tones from top to bottom. So this value rod has has 14 tones, and all of these share the same form light, the same tone. They all have the same tone at the form light, about right here. But this is dropping off. This has compressed values, and this has a higher value range, so more contrast here. But they're at the same tone at the form light. So that's just an example of how to use this organization of tone, or how it translates by just quadrating the light and controlling your values through this system. Here's another group of these shades that organizes it by the value of 4 right here at lighted shade. So all these have the common lighted shade right here, but just grow depending on the quality of light, grow differently. Okay, so in the next lecture, we'll get into the specifics of this exponential decrement of light and the geometry of that, and also more specifics about how to organize your tones and how to structure them in your mind as well as in your drawings. The main point right now in this week, as we start to tackle light on form, is just a very simplistic approach to light side, shade side. Our first thing is to just simply do the terminator line, the shade line, establish where the division between light side and shade side is. And if one thing you should notice from these value bars is that the light side can never be darker than the shadow side, right? So you're just going to begin by a very simple organization and then subdivide that no more than these 7 tones. We'll begin just by this simple division of light and dark. And then we'll think about a couple divisions beyond that in the beginning just to indicate them. But we will get to the point where we'll have very sensitive tonal transitions. But it'll always be with the overall structure maintained. Okay. That's it.